After a few years of very slow M&A activity, we're seeing some signs that the market is picking up. First of all, private equity firms are sitting on a lot of dry powder, and they have certain windows that they need to spend their money. So we're seeing an uptick in activity there. We're also seeing some activity with the AI arms race, which is creating some FOMO for folks and some acquisitions in the news. 70% of deal makers are actually expecting to see increased deal activity this year. In fact, there are more and more jobs that are being posted that are corporate development type jobs. So it appears that we are hopefully on the precipice of some accelerated activity in the M&A space. With me today is Dr. Klint Kendrick. Klint is a nationally recognized expert in the people side of mergers and acquisitions, and he's led more than 150 deals from inside Fortune 500 companies. He teaches HR M&A at NYU, and he founded Master Your Merger to help companies navigate M&A with empathy and precision. Klint is currently Senior Director, Workforce Integrations and Transitions at Walmart. Welcome, Klint. So glad you're here.
Sandra, thank you for having me.
You have a lot of good things to say and a lot of interesting things to say, starting with you've been part of more than 150 deals. And I'm curious as to, with all that experience, what is your take on the percentage of deals that are really delivering on the promise of the deal?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sandra. And I think what's unfortunate in a lot of ways is that the deal success rate has remained incredibly low for the past 40, 50, even 60 years when we look at the metrics. There's a frequently cited study by Harvard Business Review that said that between 70 and 90% of deals fail to meet their financial objectives. If we take that 80% average and we flip it, that's where we get that 20% success rate. And that number has been repeated in study after study, not just by Harvard, but also by the big four consultancies and other folks that do work in the M&A space. When I think about that, when I think about how companies choose to deploy their capital, M&A is a big investment decision that firms make, and there's just so much room to turn that success rate upside down. And we're starting to learn that it's not all about financial engineering. It's not all about trying to just gather synergies from it, though those can be very big parts of having those deals be successful. What we're learning is that it's about people. It's about culture. It's about leadership. And in fact, a recent study by McKinsey back in 2003 said that those firms that are culturally minded, they pay attention to the people side during their deals, they're actually 70% more likely to meet their revenue targets after the acquisition and 30% more likely to meet their synergy targets. So we're seeing some room inside of the culture space specifically for an increase in that success rate. And I know that as we continue to look at the people side of things, there's just going to be more and more room to make those deals more successful.
I bet you have a few things to say about that. Maybe this is a way of jumping into where you've been and what you've seen. I'd like to know a little bit about your personal story, Klint, and you have taken on this mantle of people and culture and such. Can you tell me how that came to be and why it's important to you?
Sure. So the first acquisition I went through as an acquired employee was actually not a big deal, right? We changed our email address. And the small software company I was working for as a recruiter was part of a roll-up play by a larger organization that had a consolidation strategy that they were going to then exit by selling to a public company. So the first deal, we were simply caught up in that sale. And like I said, my email address changed. Not a big deal. The second deal, still with the same company, we were sold to what at the time was the fourth largest software company in the world. How that affected me personally is that we were told about the deal. We were told that we had been sold. And the acquirer came in a couple days later and made offers to everybody. And Sandra, my offer was so, I'm going to use the phrase messed up, right? They messed with my money so much that I wasn't sure I was going to be able to feed my kids, right? I had a 2-year-old and an infant at home. And just the pay mix had changed so dramatic that I was like, am I going to be able to take care of my family? Am I going to be able to pay my rent? And the answer was really no, not with how they had shifted the offer. And in their defense, Sandra, they were not buying this firm because Klint Kendrick happened to be a recruiter carrying a large book of business, right? That was not the value proposition. It was the software business taking care of one of the big automakers down in your neck of the woods in Long Beach. And so the organization lost a lot of talent there. My book of business, which was worth about $1 million in recurring revenue, walked out the door. And a lot of other people's recurring business walked out the door. And they just really botched a number of acquisitions in, unfortunately, similar spectacular fashion and drove themselves out of business after a really slow and steady decline. So I've got a lot of passion from a personal experience. Like if I'm going to be doing the same work the next day, why should I be worried that my kids are going to go hungry when they
Right.
were fine the day before? But also, this company, had they handled those acquisitions right, had they handled the people side right, would probably still be the third or fourth largest software company in the world instead
Mm.
of delisted and non existent.
Wow, that is definitely a cautionary tale. Do you think that whoever made you that offer, do you think that they had even done the research and they even knew what the impact was? Just curious.
I honestly don't know. I like to assume good intent, right? I like to assume that people go into those kinds of interactions and they're trying to balance multiple competing priorities. That gentleman whose name I don't remember, I'm sure he doesn't remember me. I could bump into him and we wouldn't know each other. It was that long ago. I like to think that he was trying to be fair and equitable and just bring me into alignment with their compensation. They had a very different business model that they were trying to pull us into, and they were trying to do a day one integration, which usually I'm a big fan of. I think in a lot of cases, that's the right way to go. I just think that the individual impact was something that they hadn't calculated for. And when you don't calculate for the individual impact of one person, now consider multiplying that number by, I think at the time, the company we'd rolled up into had about 2,000 employees. Multiply that by, even if it's a small percentage of the workforce that are upset, let's say that it was 10%, right? You're losing 200 people that are carrying books of business.
Sure.
And just to cite another study, MIT Sloan did a survey of the excess, what I call the excess attrition rate from M&A. So how many more people leave after an acquisition event than leave from just due course of business. And that excess attrition rate for individual contributors and middle managers is right around 22%.
Wow,
Yeah, that's
that's
first year by
unintended consequences.
absolutely. Absolutely. And if
That's
those
significant.
22% are part of a revenue generating organization, that
Hmm.
revenue walks out the door. If they're part of a product development organization, that know how and your schedules walk out the door. So that 22% excess attrition, and that's from all mergers. Now, can you imagine one done poorly? That's probably up
Right.
around 40, 50%.
Good grief. Yeah, so
Yeah,
the revenue and the institutional knowledge that walks out the door is substantial. That's
right,
why so many of them don't succeed, right?
right.
So, Clint, you have this concept of listening before losing. Is that right? Tell me a little bit about what that means and how you do this.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of ways to listen to people in a deal. And sometimes I know this is going to sound odd, but this day and age, you don't even need to talk with them directly sometimes to hear what people are saying.
Mm.
Glassdoor, for example, is a great place to go look at reviews. So I can listen to employees by proxy, by what they've put out there before a deal even starts. So I can understand their concerns with the company that they're currently working for, see whether or not we're going to exacerbate those concerns as we do an acquisition. We can also understand where they are through their leaders. Now, leaders often have a very different lens. They're usually active in selling their business and not passive recipients of a message that, hey, you're about to get a job offer from a company that you may or may not like, may or may not want to work for. But we can at least listen by proxy through those leaders, all before we even look at closing the deal. And then after we announce or close the deal, we can do direct listening. I like whenever we do an acquisition announcement to walk around and talk with people, just find out what's on their mind, what their
Mm.
concerns are. Some people will be really forthright and honest. Other people are more guarded, which is very much human nature. And I try to respect people where they are. The other way that we can listen is through their managers. And I'm a huge fan of stay interviews. So the idea that your critical talent is having conversations with people that they trust and they're saying, hey, this is why I do this job. This is why I work for this company. These are the things that are important to me and make me want to stick around. And then, of course, there's the classic pulse and culture surveys that a lot of firms use to listen. And the key thing with listening is that we have to then take action, right? If you tell me that I'm doing something that doesn't work for you and I continue with that behavior, then you have the right to choose how our relationship works, right? Are we still in a relationship or am I looking for relationships elsewhere? And so we do have to take action on what we're hearing where we can, but at least responding lets people know that we care, that we've heard them, that they're important to us in the context of the deal. And that makes people much more likely to stick around and continue to deliver the value post acquisition that they delivered prior to them knowing about the deal.
Yeah, I think when you talk about the taking action part and walking into the listening sessions, whatever they might be, it feels like it's important to set expectations around we may not be able to act on everything. It can be a kind of a tricky balance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I come down to with there is that people after an acquisition announcement, and by the way, this effect often lasts for a year or more. We see
Mhm.
that in the research that it doesn't end the day that the acquirer rolls up, shares the message, and then the integration team rolls away at roughly day 100. These effects can last a while, but people are in this state of uncertainty. Like, they don't
Mhm.
know what's going on. And if you think about it from a sort of a neuroscience perspective, right, there are literally parts of our brain that are wired to react to threats. And in a world of uncertainty, our brain actually perceives threats that may or may not exist. So if we think about our ancient ancestors wandering through the savannah, tall grasses, and they hear a noise behind them, the brain is wired to run in case it's a lion or another land predator, right? But if it's just the wind, what's the worst that happens is I feel a little bit embarrassed, but you know what? I am around to run again. And
And
it's the
mergers are
same way.
noisy. There's a lot of blowing wind, right?
Isn't that the truth? Yeah, absolutely. So when we let people know what's going on, to your point, if we know that it's windy outside, we're more likely to stop and take a look around and go, okay, is this actually a threat to my survival? Or is it just the wind? To ground this in reality instead of the analogy now, when we're honest with people, when we're transparent about what's going on, often I have a conversation that's, you know what, the medical plan is what the medical plan is. Everybody's on the same benefits. Our bonus plan is what our bonus plan is. So you're going to be pulled onto our bonus program, if indeed that's what we're doing. The in office presence policy is what it is. And so we can at least tell people up front what their workplace expectations are going to be, what some of their total rewards are going to look like, and take those concerns off the table, or allow them to make an informed decision about whether or not the free parking that they no longer have is
Mm.
worth a new job search. And some people are going to say, yeah, actually it is. That free parking was super, super important to me. Yeah, I'm going to go look for another job. And then we honor that as they're on the way out and try to provide resources for them because the rest of the team is looking how we treat those people that are
Such a
exiting.
great point. Such a great point. Backing up a minute, you talked about specifically middle management and individual contributors. And you also mentioned that leaders are in the know. Let's talk a little bit about middle managers because they're their own breed for sure.
They are. Yeah. So when I think about middle managers, what I immediately think about is their really important role linking senior leaders and frontline employees. And everybody has a role to play in our work ecosystem, right? Senior leaders provide direction, they provide strategy, they provide resources and priorities. And that's a very important role in this. And your frontline workers are the ones who are ultimately executing on whatever those strategies and priorities are. And then in the middle, you've got these managers whose job is to really be that linking function between the two, turning big strategy into actionable steps that their frontline employees can take. And when we come into a merger scenario, what ends up happening is those middle managers are often left behind. In my mind, that is one of the most cruel things that we can do to a human being is put them in a position where they are forced to not only navigate their own change journey, but now they have to go take care of the employees that they lead because most middle managers feel responsible for the well-being of their employees. Again,
Sure.
I assume good intent and I am seldom let down when I start to think about what motivates people to become a manager. Sure, the pay's nice, but it really is about taking care of a team, leading a team, and broadening their impact. And so, because of that, whenever possible, I think it's important to give middle managers a preview of whatever it is that you're doing. They end up carrying a lot of that emotional water, trying to often negotiate salaries or negotiate idiosyncratic deals where there's sort of one off arrangements. And all of the time that they're doing that, they're not able to focus on their own journey and their own process of dealing with, you know what, they're in the exact same position as the employees they're trying to deal with, right?
Mhm.
They don't know what their pay looks like,
Right.
their future looks like. So I really think that we need to give middle managers some extra love. And we do that by giving them a heads up before an announcement meeting, 30 minutes before. Pull your middle managers in, tell them what's going on, number one. Number two, give them some resources. A lot of people are familiar with what's called the bridges transition model. It's basically a reverse hump, and something happens and your mood, your performance, your productivity goes down. We sometimes call that the productivity dip. And you end up in this zone of exploration where you're trying to figure it out. And then you'll figure it out and it'll go up and it'll go down, it'll go up and it'll go down. But at some point, you figured it out and you come out. The other one that we do is the Kubler-Ross model, which is the stages of grief. And either of those are great for that middle manager. And then third, we give them resources to deal with their own reactions.
Hmm.
So I often recommend things like the company's employee assistance program, depending on sometimes having that neutral third party listen is a really great way to give managers some space so they're not feeling like they have to complain to their boss. They can talk to somebody who actually is trained to understand human behavior and have those conversations. I will hold office hours. I'm not a therapist, but I understand what's going on in M&A. And so we'll try to answer those concerns as best we can. And I try to encourage their leaders to do the same thing to make sure that those managers have the resources they need.
Yeah, no, that's great stuff. I think you're absolutely right. They just get lost in the shuffle, and they are not only caring for all the people who work for them, but they also need to care for themselves. How about toolkits in terms of cascading, not just messaging down, really helping a mid-level manager explain and articulate why we're doing this and what it means and why it's important to us, that kind of thing. How do you generally do that?
Yeah. So again, in my experience, we provide those resources usually during the meeting and then some sort of FAQ document. I've not personally done this, but I know that some firms will buy, there's some books out on the market that kind of help walk managers through their process. Price Pritchett used to be the gold standard back in the 80s and 90s. And I have a bookshelf full of M&A books, and I've actually got a few of those that I've looked through. I'm like, these aren't bad. I would love to stop doing that. The tools are really important to have. I think what's as important is understanding when to deploy them. When I think about the journey, there's these inflection points. So when the deal gets announced, big inflection point, empower your middle managers. When you issue the offer letters, some firms will issue those on announcement day, which there's pros and cons to each practice. I personally like it because it gives employees the assurance that they have a job because they've got an
Mhm.
offer letter, right? So if you can do that closer to announce, I think that's great. But when the offer letters are released, giving those middle managers a heads up on what their employees are going to get offered, really helpful for them to help
Sure.
explain what's going on with the employee. When the deal closes, I think that's another good time to have conversations with those managers. And then finally, when the payroll transition occurs, if it does occur, when everybody has a new payroll provider, a new pay schedule, new benefits, and any other major changes, those are times in my mind when you want to pull those managers in
Mm.
and you want to have a very specific conversation with them. We know, Sandra, that managers are the most trusted source of information during any kind of major change event. And we're not doing the managers a favor, we're caring for them. But in reality, we're doing ourselves a favor because there's only so many of us on the acquiring side to deliver those messages. But if we can empower, equip, and really deputize these middle managers to help that transition go more smoothly, we're just helping everybody.
Absolutely. And I love the way, Clint, that you broke it down into customer experience. They call it the moments that matter, these
Yeah.
key inflection points, because I don't know that people necessarily think about, sure, they think about announcement day, but in terms of these are the days that are of great importance and great emotion and a really good time to know X. Those are, I think, helpful guideposts. Let's actually talk about announcement day and dig into that a little bit more. What do you generally recommend and what do you think is really important on announcement day?
Yeah. So I think it's important to recognize that you have multiple stakeholders that you're trying to balance on announcement day. And the message really needs to be shaped for each of those stakeholder groups. I'm not a corporate communications expert, so I won't pretend to advise people on what the market-facing communication should be, but there should be something that goes out to the market if you're choosing to make it public, right? There's your stakeholders out in the market. There's your shareholders that will want some sort of communication about what's going on there. And all of that's great. Where I focus is on the employee announcement day. And what I think should happen is, first off, the folks that are delivering the first message should actually be the seller. So it should be a trusted leader from the sell side that is delivering the message, hey, I'm excited. We've just been purchased, or we're entering into an agreement to be purchased, depending on whether it's a simultaneous sign and close or not. But the point is that somebody from the seller should actually be delivering the news initially and then hand it over. And unfortunately, what I tend to see, Sandra, in a lot of cases is that the very next conversation tends to be about 10 minutes worth of market-facing detail. Like, this is the strategy, this is where we see you fitting big picture. And all of that is important, but it's not the right time to have that
Tell me
conversation.
about me. What does this mean to
Exactly.
me?
Exactly. I
Yeah.
have literally sat in rooms and watched while leaders who are really energetic and engaging and dynamic and caring are talking about deal synergies. Meanwhile, everybody in the room is on their phone and they're texting their loved ones going, OMG, we just got bought. And the response is, oh my gosh, do you still have a job? That is literally
Right.
the first question that comes across. And what's the response if the leader's up there talking about numbers and strategy and product lines? Is, I
No,
don't
I
know.
don't. Yeah. Or
Or it's reaching out to that company whose headhunter called a few days ago and saying, you know what, maybe I will take that interview. Where I think that the better approach is to say, yes, you know what, we've got some great plans. We're going to take this product that you love to market, and we're going to share more about that in a few minutes. But let's talk about how this affects you first. And people really have three key questions. And we already covered the first one. Do I still have a job? That's, if we think about Maslow's hierarchy, can I feed my family? And if we fail to answer that, we've already lost them. The second thing that we have to answer is, will my job be as good? And so we're moving up Maslow's hierarchy into a different set of needs. Will my job be as good answers a different need than, do I still have a job? And then finally, the third question is, will you treat me fairly? And we demonstrate that more in our actions than in our words, but we also share it by talking about procedural justice, meaning, is the process fair? How are we going to come up with your job offers? If there are reductions, how are we going to determine who stays and who goes? And so having those kinds of conversations very transparently, it may not win us a lot of love because nobody loves that kind of change, that sort of imposed change, but at least people know that we're leveling with them and we're concerned about them and their experience. Then after we've addressed that, then we can move into the strategy piece, though I do recommend that be a different session on a different day, because at that time, people will have had a chance to process this
right.
change. They can go home to their loved ones and the important people in their lives that they make those decisions with and have the conversations, and then come back the next day and ask those questions. One situation, Sandra, that I dealt with many years ago was somebody had a kid with cancer. And so I'll be honest, they really did not care about the go-to-market strategy. They cared about whether or not
Right.
their kid could
Health
continue with chemo.
benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the entire firm was rallied around that kid because it had become such a part of this organization where everybody hung together and cared for each other, that until we answered continuity of care questions for
Everybody
a
in the
sick
room
child.
is looking and thinking, yeah,
Yeah.
is Joe's kid going to be okay? Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So the one other thing that I would love to add, because this is, if I had a soapbox here, I'd get it out and get on top of it, because this is one of my big things in M&A. There is a desire by leaders to give comfort. People in distress, it's a very human reaction to want to comfort them, right? What do we say to our kids when they get hurt? They're there, it'll be okay. And the corporate response to that during an acquisition announcement is, nothing's going to change. And that is the biggest lie on the
Yeah.
face of the earth in that moment. It already has changed, right? I have a new owner, right? Even if you're going to leave my company as a portfolio company, which I worked for a company for quite a while, that's what we did. We acquired, we didn't integrate, we held it in a portfolio, and we really looked at only ways where we could be additive. Some cost savings here, some talent acquisition there. when I would go in and act as basically a fractional chief HR officer in those situations. But the reality is that even if their benefits, their day to day work, their boss, the name on their business card, their email, none of that changed. They now had a new corporate owner. And so
Right.
something had already changed. And to go in and say nothing's going to change, you're already a liar,
Yeah.
whether you meant to
It's
be or not.
right. It just comes off as being extremely disingenuous.
Yeah.
We all
Yeah.
know better than that, right?
And it's just such a huge unforced error.
Yes, yes. So we only have a few minutes left, but I'd love to get your perspective, Clint, on everything in the world is changing very rapidly
Yeah,
from AI to just a world that is moving continuously. So what does that mean from your perspective to the future of M&A?
sure.
What's it going to look like?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different ways that this could go. I actually just put a LinkedIn post on yesterday talking about the way that AI purchases, so these are companies buying other companies for AI reason, are becoming more talent plays. Meta just purchased a company and they actually only purchased a 49% stake, so a minority stake, but part of that agreement was that that AI team was going to come over and basically form a center of excellence inside Meta. And we've seen similar plays by other big providers like Microsoft. That's an interesting deal structure where you only buy part of it and then you acqui-hire the talent. So I think we may see more of that as companies look to really understand this emerging, evolving world of AI from a business perspective. I think AI from a day to day work perspective, we still have to figure out. And this is an area where, at least in my world, we're trying to leverage AI to do some of the grunt work of running the HR side of an acquisition.
Hmm.
I can use AI to go do a lot of that listening, for example. When we do like benefits information sessions, we did a 1,000 person deal a couple years ago, and I can't do one-on-ones with 1,000 people. I don't have a big enough team. So we did these large meetings and we asked people to put their questions in the chat. And we just dumped that into generative AI of 2 years ago,
Hmm.
right? Which actually was pretty good at sorting these
Huh.
questions out. And that allowed us to then follow up and close the loop. Hey, we answered the questions we could during the session, but here's what you wanted to know more about, and here's what we can share with you at this point, pointing them to resources. So I think we'll see a lot more listening application. I'm hoping to see it do some additional work in terms of where the talent sits in an organization. We can do that through AI driven network analysis,
Hmm.
where we're trying to understand communication pathways inside an organization. I think AI can be really helpful with answering questions like with chatbots. So I think there's a lot of those general employee experience things that we'll start seeing emerge in AI. But I think as the economy shakes down, we may see more distressed company buys. Right now, we're at about a 20-year lull in activity, partly brought on by the economic uncertainty that companies are facing. Companies like certainty. They choose where to
I
invest
do.
based on certain baseline projections. Companies are like choosing not to do earnings forecasts. If things remain chaotic, I think that we will probably see more companies that are about to go bankrupt selling themselves
Hmm.
so that they can save the great products and the great jobs that those firms have. So that's one way I think that we might see things going. And that requires a certain skill set to really turn those around. And I think this is where we might see PE coming to play. We're starting to see in the PE space, they're sitting on about $5 trillion in dry powder in PE.
Yep.
And then I'm hearing
And they
rumblings
have a
at family
window,
office.
right? They have to
Yes.
spend that.
And it's interesting because the Qatari finance minister a couple of months ago was pointing to PE being in trouble because they're not able to invest during their windows and do the returns. So I think we might see PE starting to do more of these distressed company buys
Hmm.
so that they can really turn them around. But that's not been their normal play. Their normal play has really been more of a financial engineering play. And they're
Right.
now having to look at talent as a play, which means the buyer's got to figure out the talent side and the seller, if they want to get multiples of their company that they're selling, even when it's distressed, are going to need to justify the value of their talent to a potential buyer. I also think that we're going to probably see many more roll ups. The other
Hmm.
thing that I think we're not really contending with here in the US is the baby boom is a giant generation of people, many of whom own businesses. And so I think as these folks retire, we'll see a lot more consolidation of these mom and pop businesses that really didn't grow a lot, but Junior doesn't want to buy the business. He's not interested in running dad's plumbing shop, but there probably is somebody who will buy that and consolidate it. I think we're going to see a lot more action on the middle and lower ends of the
Mm.
market compared to the bigger marquee buys of the last decade and a half. But I have been wrong about a lot of things in my life, Sandra. So I would not make any
We
bets
won't
based
hold
on
you
that.
to
Yeah.
it. Clint, I would love to get your thoughts for anybody who may be watching who may be facing an integration. If you have one important piece of advice for a leader who is going through an integration, what would you tell them?
Act like you give a damn.
Oh, love it. Love
Yeah,
it.
I wish I could take credit for it. My friend Lynette Buitt actually gave me that advice. We were talking one day about just some of our frustrations, practitioner to practitioner. She goes, That's the one piece of advice I was given. I'm like, I am stealing that. And Chandra, I think what's important, it is not give a damn because I really think that leaders do care. Right. I don't know a lot of leaders who are cold hearted and do not care about their people. They negotiate hard on the front end, they advocate hard after close for their people. And the leaders of the acquirers are similarly situated, right? They do care about the people. They want this thing to be successful. We have a hard time, especially in corporate America, showing that we care and
Hmm.
acting like we care. So it's not so much about the care, because I believe that they really do care. It's that they need to act like they care. And that's demonstrated through these high touch interactions. It means that you're giving up your time. You're not just popping into the acquisition announcement and then turning it over to your lieutenant to go manage or ghosting this workforce. It means that you have a
Right.
presence, you show up, you're a steady, stabilizing force, you hold office hours, you ask and answer questions, and you just show up. And so that would be the one thing I would say that leaders could do that would make the biggest difference in their integrations is act like they care.
That is such great advice, and especially because I think leaders assume that I do care, and so you must know I care,
Right.
and really engaging in a way all along where people can see that as optics matter, right?
Yeah. And say it out loud with your words. Like, I care. I really want you to
Mm,
do well. I want to do what I can to help you through this transition and make it as smooth as possible. A lot of leaders don't actually say those
mm,
words out loud, and they
yeah.
need to.
Yeah, good stuff. Clint, where can people who may be watching or listening find more goodness from you? I know you have a few things going on, so tell us about them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm an open networker on LinkedIn. So anybody who wants to connect on LinkedIn, and I do my best if folks want to do like a 10 or 15-minute coffee chat. I'm unfortunately no longer in the position where I can give up an hour at a time because my day job obviously requires a good bit of my time, but I'm happy to do like a quick 10, 15-minute coffee chat with folks. I also run a monthly roundtable for HR and M&A practitioners. And you can find out more about those at masteryourmerger.com. I have a podcast, and I will say, Sandra, you were a recent guest on the podcast. When that airs, I'm hoping some folks will get to hear more from you and some of your insights as a person who's played quite a lot in the M&A space. And then I run a couple of conferences a year called the People Synergy Summit. And if you don't mind me sharing, we made the decision to make those free for people to attend
Hmm.
virtually this year. I heard that a lot of folks, as we talked about with the economic conditions that we're in, the first thing that goes is training budgets. And we've had the fortune of some great sponsors that have allowed us to put that on for free. So people that want to do M&A work better can come to that conference and listen to some leading voices in the space.
Wow, that's amazing that you're doing that. You're giving back to the community that way. So thank you for your time, your insight, and for sharing in many ways.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity, Sandra. It's been great to get to know you. And I know that when it comes to people who give a damn, people who care, you're definitely one of the folks on that list.
Thank you. I'm proud to be one who cares.
Yeah.
Such a pleasure, Clint. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Please subscribe and all that other good stuff. If you're interested in some follow up resources, check the show notes and you will get a worksheet and some other follow up resources. Have a great day.